Testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
Check, 1, 2, check. Check, 1, 2. Check, 1, 2.
Hello, hello, hello. Are we good? Testing 1, 2. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at Neurovation 2023. Just so you all know, food and beverage stations located to my left, your right, will be closing in 15 minutes for the beginning of the program. The industry panel hosted by the HBITO will begin in 11 minutes over in Classroom 1, which you can access through this +15 behind me. There are food and beverage stations over there that will remain open for the whole duration of the event. So if you need a bite or a beverage, please see yourself over there. If we can also just start getting prepared for the program to begin, as in please start taking a seat, and if conversations can start to decrease.
Testing. Testing.
That's all we can do.
Hello, everyone. Can we please start taking a seat so the program can begin in the next 5 minutes? Please refresh your beverage and some bites over to my left, your right. And if we can please take a seat so we can begin the program in about 5 minutes. All right, everyone, we are ready to start the program. So can we please get everyone who is not seated, seated? I'd just like to start with some housekeeping rules. My name is Jasmine. I am the Events and Engagement Specialist at the HBI. For all of your information, we have one all-gendered bathroom down here and 4 all-gendered bathrooms right back here. To access the networking space, which is at the end of this event, you will just go through this +15. There is a sign right behind this screen, so on the back of the pitch stage to access that space. Should you feel so inclined to grab a beverage or a bite during the program, food and bar will be open the whole time in that space. Food and bar will be closed. Food and bar, can you please close here? Thank you. For the duration of the program, we will get a 15-minute intermission at 4-ish o'clock. Given that we're starting 15 minutes behind, it might be a little bit later. Can we please make sure we keep the stairwells clear so people can go up and down? I will kindly ask that row to just scoot over. Oh, perfect. Thank you so much, you guys. Okay, we are ready to begin, so I will pass it off to the HBI's director, Dr. David Park. Give it up for Dr. David Park.
Oh, wait, I have one of these. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I am David, as Jasmine said, the director of the Hotchkiss. I just want to preface this by saying I am not an entrepreneur, but I support entrepreneurs, and you can tell I'm not one because I have a tie, like a typical bureaucrat. You will see on the panel people who do not wear ties. They're all the entrepreneurs. Some actually look like Jeff Bezos, and others look like, right? With the turtleneck. Anyway, so I want to thank you. Welcome to Neurovation, a celebration of innovation in the neurosciences. We're so tickled pink that you are here. This is one of hopefully many of a series that we'll be doing. But before we begin, I want to just acknowledge our event today is taking place on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and of course the city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And I also want to mention that today is a special day. It is the UN International Day of Women and Girls in Science. So before I hand it over to Lawrence, because I'll be very, very short, well, maybe not that short, but I need to thank people. So number one, I need to thank the Campus Alberta Neuroscience for really their support in the live streaming virtual portion of this program. There are people all across Alberta who are watching this. So thank you, Ken, for doing this, and thank you for AV for so seamlessly integrating our efforts across Alberta. And secondly, I want to thank the Hotchkiss Brain Institute Training Organization who organized the HBI-TO industry panel. You guys are incredibly energetic, wonderful, and well organized, and I think really HBI is just a wonderful organization because of all your efforts, so thank you. So those are the two major things that I'd like to thank. But mostly I want to thank all of you for coming because HBI is all about making impact in the community, and it's important for us to connect with you both in the academic community and the entrepreneurial city of Calgary. So thank you. I want to take this opportunity because some of you may not know what HBI is and who we are. I just want to say it's the Hotchkiss Brain Institute, of course, established in 2004 with the support of the community, and particularly Harley, the namesake of the institute. It's now grown to about 300 faculty members, 1,400 trainees and staff, and we do pretty much all brain research all the time in many, many different priority areas that you would expect of brain institutes with advanced technology and platforms. And that's really all that we're very, very dedicated to is promoting research programs that make impact in the community. One way in which we do that is to really encourage our members to be cutting edge, innovators, take risk, high risk and high reward, and really take your ideas or their ideas into into humans, into patients, into the community, as well as making foundational, fundamental discoveries about how the brain functions and how the nervous system functions. And I'm incredibly proud of our members who do this really at an incredibly high level. And I'll just say that, as evidence for this, some of our researchers has made some incredibly important, worldwide, impactful breakthroughs. And in fact, in the past several years, about 30 new companies have been generated by our HBI members. And so we're incredibly proud of that. So thank you all for making those contributions. I want to especially welcome, because I won't get a chance to welcome and thank Josh Cohen and Justin Klee, co-founders of Amylyx. Their story is extraordinary, and it is something that will elevate, I think, our ambitions and what we want to do and how we want to actually interact with the community, right? I won't say anything. I did have lunch with them, and I am just so incredibly impressed with how they think about science, how they think about entrepreneurship, and how they move forward in helping the world community at large. So thank you so much. So now I want to just introduce you to Dr. Lawrence Korngut, really the Director of Innovation at HBI. He has been my muse. Not only does he look, as I said, entrepreneurial, but he tells me about how to do it and what to think and how to support and be supportive of this environment. So he and I, mostly he, have really been at the driving and leading edge of thinking about innovation and the innovation agenda. So Lawrence, you're also a neurologist, you're also an entrepreneur, you wear many hats, but in this case, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So really amazing to be here with you all this afternoon and into this evening. This is something that we've envisioned, that we wanted to bring the community together. There's so many innovators amongst us. There's so many brilliant researchers, trainees, clinicians that are doing incredible work that I think coming together is really the key to helping us build forward. We're fortunate to be at the University of Calgary, which is the most entrepreneurial university in Canada. We're fortunate to be at the Cummings School of Medicine, and HBI in particular has really always had a strength, and I'm going to share just a few slides, has always really had a strength in terms of basic discovery research, in terms of understanding how brain circuits work, investigating brain and mental health disorders. And if you look at the mission statement of the Hotchkiss, it really is to have global impact from a scientific perspective. And I think we do that very well. We're a major contributor, and certainly that's been a success from which we are building. But the key to research in the end, and different types of research have different purposes and different impacts and different outcomes. But ultimately the goal is, of course, to help people, to help our community, to help the global community in terms of people living healthier lives, both from the brain and mental health perspective, as we think of it at the Hotchkiss. And we've had tremendous success in this regard. If you look at ischemic stroke, we have a world-class stroke research and clinical program that's reduced mortality in stroke by 50%, has changed the standard of care multiple times now. Multiple sclerosis, discovery that reduces the relapse rate of multiple sclerosis, cross-campus collaboration in concussion, reducing concussions in youth hockey very significantly. And this is just, a couple of examples of the tangible benefits to society that have emerged out of the Hotchkiss Brain Institute. But importantly, if you take research and you accelerate it and you invest in it and you move it really, really quickly, and you don't think about innovative opportunities to then turn that research into impact in the community, you sort of end up with a scenario where you're not maximizing, and sometimes you're missing opportunities to really improve the lives of people. And certainly in my role as a neurologist in the ALS clinic, we work really hard to connect patients with new opportunities, new clinical trials. I'll mention a little bit more about ALS later because it's relevant to our fireside chat. But we want to create seamless opportunities for our discoveries to enter the world and be useful to people, be accessible to individuals. And so that is a key direction of our innovation program. One other thing that we as a community need to discuss more, we need to be comfortable with, is this concept of if we want to drive impact. Now, not all research should be commercialized. You know, in fact, most probably doesn't need to go down that pathway. But in terms of applied innovations, in terms of discoveries that can tangibly benefit people in the immediate future or the near future, it is important to recognize that building value is an important part of driving impact. And in some places in the world, that's an obvious thing. I think that's something in Canada we're learning about. We are learning how to proceed down these paths. And importantly, commercialization is, you know, in many cases, the right vehicle or the only vehicle to make these impacts happen. And that's, in many ways, what this evening is about, is reconciling a bit around both of these important concepts. And importantly, we again come at this from success. University of Calgary has once again been ranked #1 in terms of startup creation in Canada 2 years in a row, and I'm proud to say that Hotchkiss is a big contributor to that statistic. We do create a large number of companies that come out of the University of Calgary, and of course now we want success for those companies. Now we want to facilitate, you know, networks and opportunities for these companies. And so the purpose of tonight is really kind of threefold. One is to just bring us all together and get to know each other and learn from each other. Number two, to hear some of the success stories of our entrepreneurs at Hotchkiss who are scientists and clinicians. And then the third is to hear about a company and two co-founders that really did have a tremendous and are having a tremendous impact, but have also used value to drive that forward. So we'll be learning and hearing their story, and there'll be lots of time for questions and answers, and there's of course networking afterwards. We also have 11 Hotchkiss affiliated companies, you know, in that direction. So when you get a chance, especially after the fireside, make sure to stop by, say hello, get to know your peers. And I know there's many more in the audience that you know, you're entrepreneurs, you're building companies, and so it's important to connect in that regard. And so just to highlight, you know, this slide is just meant to represent some of the companies that have come out of Hotchkiss and are finding success. And many of the entrepreneurs, the CEO, the founding scientists are in the audience tonight. And so if you're a trainee, if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you, of course, to connect. You know, the way we build this ecosystem, of course, is through collaborating together. We do have a defined innovation strategy to promote this type of work at the Hotchkiss. The Hopewell Mind Prize was just launched, a $10 million contribution, $1 million a year to high-risk, high-reward research on the research side. And then, of course, you know, working with the university in terms of the USEED program, in terms of funding our startups as they evolve out, and then connecting, of course, to the private sector and our investment community to support those moving forward. And so at this point, I think we should move into the panels. We do have two separate panels. We have the industry panels put on by the HBI trainee organization. So I'd encourage the trainees at this point to move over to the room with the panel, and we can get that started. And at the same time, I'll start with the panel of our scientist to entrepreneur panel for the remainder of the audience. So why don't we go ahead with that? I can introduce you. Hello, hello. We're good? Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm pleased to begin our first panel, which is our Scientist to Entrepreneur panel. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Aaron Phillips, who is a professor of physiology and pharmacology, clinical neurosciences, and biomedical engineering at the Hotchkiss Brain Institute. He's the director of the Restore Network, which is a platform dedicated to developing translational technology for neurological injury. He publishes in top journals, including Nature and Nature Biotechnology. He works as an advisor for and is a key shareholder in Onward Medical, a publicly traded company that is commercializing his discoveries related to spinal cord injury and neurostimulation. Aaron is also the CEO of a new venture, HemoTX, a company focused on developing new approaches for diagnosing and treating autonomic health. Aaron.
Appreciate it. Hello, hello, hello. You guys can hear me? All right, I'm excited for this session. We get to learn from some of the experts at the U of C and neuroscience entrepreneurs that have innovated commercialization initiatives from their lab. Super exciting, and I want to emphasize, like Lawrence said, you know, the HBI is a real driver of commercialization and startups, and has really been one of the key reasons why Calgary is one of the most innovative universities in Canada, and I think ranked #1, as you said, for 2 years running. So I don't want to waste any time. I'm going to introduce all the speakers, and then we want you guys to ask questions and be interactive. I have some database questions, but I would much prefer if you guys were out there taking the opportunity that you have to chat with these guys, okay? So first up, we have Dr. Alan Mitha. You guys can come up, I think. Have a good time? Yeah. So first up, we have Dr. Alan Mitha. Alan was trained as a neurosurgeon at the University of Calgary and the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Arizona, and he completed a master's degree in biomedical engineering at Harvard. Don't want to skip that. Since 2011, he has been practicing as a cerebrovascular, endovascular, skull-based surgeon at Foothills, and he's now an associate professor here in clinical neurosciences and also biomedical engineering. He runs a research laboratory that focuses on biomedical device development and is co-founder, president, and chief technology officer at Fluid Biomed, which I think you'll hear a lot about tonight, and it's super exciting, and they've had a lot of recent success, so awesome stuff, and a good opportunity to ask questions about fundraising, US fundraising, stuff like that. And he's actually commercializing the first bioabsorbable stent to cure brain aneurysms. So give it up for Alan. Next up, we have Dr. Alex McGirr. Alex is a clinician scientist and associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at U of C, and he's the director of the non-invasive neurostimulation network that goes by N3. His research program, it does preclinical modeling of stress-related conditions, intersectional approaches to enhance brain stim for primarily psychiatric disorders, and he is the CEO of McGirr Corp, which is spelled differently from your name, but I think we know what it means, yeah. And also the CSO of SalvoStim, which is developing and testing small molecules that enhance TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, for major depressive disorder. Give it up for Alex. And next up, we have Dr. Deborah Koresh, and she is an accomplished scientist and entrepreneur who holds the position of CEO and co-founder of Path Therapeutics, a biotech company developing novel therapeutics for brain disorders. Path was spun out of technology developed in her academic lab at the U of C, and she is a professor in the Department of Medical Genetics and a scientist in the HBI and the Children's Hospital. Path Therapeutics is currently raising its Series A to advance its lead program in pediatric epilepsy into the clinic. So give it up for Debbie. And then finally, I get to introduce Lawrence after you already met him, but he's a neurologist, neurotechnology entrepreneur. Lawrence is the director of innovation, as David Park mentioned, in the HBI, and he really leads the efforts to support researchers to commercialize. And he's really been a big game changer in the HBI in terms of pushing us to really think about how to commercialize our findings from the lab and not just leave them there. Push them forward to help patients in the community, bring them all the way to market. Lawrence co-founded Lumio, a successful health data technology company operating data programs in 18 countries now. And Lawrence is also specializes clinically in diseases of the muscles and the nerves. So thanks, Lawrence. Okay, so as the moderator, I'm going to just take the first question, and then we'll pass it off to the audience. But one question that I think resonates with all of us, and it's not to any specific person, maybe you guys can all touch on it, but what are the biggest challenges and opportunities? I left it broad so you guys can talk about a variety of things, but challenges and opportunities, so bad things and benefits of academic spin-outs. You know, what are the benefits, pros and cons of spinning out research from the lab into a commercialization project? Are there particular pitfalls, or what are the key kind of strengths of doing it that way?
Yeah, so I can start here. So there's obviously numerous challenges and benefits. Can you hear me? Yes. Big benefit is, I treat patients all the time on a daily basis. Patients come in with ruptured aneurysms, and we take them to the angio suite. We either coil their aneurysm or clip their aneurysm. It's very satisfying, but this this takes a lot of time. But the number of people you can help is far greater than you could typically do as a neurosurgeon or any kind of clinician, and you can make a huge impact, a massive impact, and which is the whole goal of commercializing it, making your technologies, your findings translatable to a far greater population. So that's a benefit. I think there are numerous challenges as well. And one of the biggest challenges, I would say, is if you're a founder of a company that's spun out from an academic lab, you don't have that background. You don't have the background in business. There's so many skills that you have yet to develop, and it's almost daunting to think about all those skills that you need to be successful. One of the biggest advantages of being here in Calgary right now, I think, is some CDL. We went into CDL not really knowing Creative Destruction Lab, not really knowing what it would do for us, but we were put in front of all these people who had that background, had the knowledge, the business knowledge. We got hooked up with a student at the Haskins School of Business that can help with our business plan and our executive summary, and it really helped. And so I think that was the main challenge for us, was getting those additional business skills that we had no knowledge of previously.
Anyone else?
I think one of the advantages of being in the academic lab is that we're really close to the science. We're in it. People show up to work every day, and they are dedicated fully to the project. And so I think that I think that we are really driven by making the science better and understanding it at a deeper level. And so I think that makes for better technology. I think one of the challenges that we face is that historically academics have been poor business people. And so there's a bias that an academic can't possibly run a company. And I think that it's changing. And I think that some academics, that's the case, they're best in the lab, but I don't think that's all academics. And so I think that one of the challenges is trying to get over that bias before they get to know you or the company, that we actually, while we don't have all the business skills, and I think that's where you try to find complementary because I think we're well aware of our limitations, but also to try to get people interested in your idea that you can actually do this. I think that's a hurdle that we face.
Thanks, Debbie.
Yeah. So I think one of the best parts about starting it off in a university is that you get access to some of the brightest minds, and you can sharpen ideas. You can really come up with interesting ideas. You get to interact with colleagues that are very critical, can see the broader picture, can see where you don't necessarily see the technology, the invention going. For example, Lawrence told me very clearly, and I remember this very distinctly, that the best way I could kill my idea was to publish it, and that I needed to try and make it, so for it to get to people, I needed to try and commercialize. And I would have never thought of that had I not had somebody like Lawrence in the infrastructure that we have, in the ecosystem that we have. I think one of the biggest challenges from my perspective is that there's only so much of you to go around. And when you start taking on new roles, and there's a very steep learning curve and very, very clear deliverables and timelines for these kinds of deliverables, and that is not something we're used to as academics. We're used to being able to take our time and only deliver when it's perfect or ready, or we think it's ready, and you actually have to move pretty fast if you want to get things to people.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add, in my journey, I run pretty much what's a health data research program in the neuromuscular disease space. We were able to build out a national registry, 50 clinics, have a lot of learnings around how do we leverage health data to benefit patients, to benefit the patient community. And what was interesting, when we launched Lumio, we were able to deploy that knowledge into 18 different countries over the next couple of years. But yeah, there was a lot of barriers, a lot of challenges, but there were so many learnings that then fed back to the research program. Even as an investigator, what you learn from a commercial approach in terms of the rigor of the execution, the expectations of the project management, that really elevated what we were doing on the research side. That really was an advantage, and I think it'll be interesting to hear the different perspectives, through the evening, but certainly there's a lot of barriers. I mean, entrepreneurship is all about barriers and in terms of moving through those barriers. But I think one great advantage we have at the University of Calgary in general, is such a collegial group, and I think reaching out to colleagues, reaching out to, if you're a scientist, reaching out for the clinical expertise or vice versa, but also in terms of the business knowledge and all of that. Everything is around us in terms of accessing it and getting through those barriers. And I think you'll hear that from Josh and Justin tonight in terms of their experience. It's all about identifying the barriers and then breaking through them, and often you need help for that.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. I think there's an immense amount of resources in the university ecosystem for getting an idea out into a place where you can pitch it. But then when you start going into the business aspect, there starts to become more and more issues with, we're not businessmen, and we can tap into the resources to get better at that, but sometimes they're just stronger at those features, right? Any questions from the audience? This is kind of open for everyone to learn and ask, and we've got people coming around with microphones, and that's really the spirit here of this one, of this session. Jasmine, are you heading towards a question? Yeah, maybe just holler it out.
So I'm curious because that growth strategy that you all took from startup to getting traction, because obviously it's not that hard to say you're a startup. It's really hard to get traction and move forward from there towards obviously some profitability. So I would just hear a little bit about your growth strategies, each of you. I think that'd be interesting.
Yeah, anyone want to take this traction from kind of calling yourself a startup to, all the necessary things we all know about to actually get it to market, right? It's a huge, huge journey.
I think, simply put, it's called a lot of wine. It's really, I think that it's hard. They call it the valley of death for a reason, right? You're starting here and you're trying to get there, and there's a valley of death. Lawrence calls it the jungle. Use your analogy as you wish. I think it's very hard to find your way through that and to try to, I was talking with Aaron about this, that it's almost a philosophical point. It's hard to figure out at what point do I just need to persevere and get through it, and then at what point our market force is trying to tell me something that maybe it's not the right idea at the wrong time, at the right time. Maybe there's something inherent about the technology, it needs to be pivoted. And so it's hard to, I think, make decisions about when do you stay the course because you'll come through the other side, and when do you need to pay attention to the feedback you're getting. And I think that's what makes the valley of death that much more challenging. I don't have an answer for you. If I did, I wouldn't be in it. But I think that, I do think that the longer you stay in it, the more you see the light at the end, and you come through it.
Yeah, it's a good question because what I kind of equate that to is the startup. You can incorporate, you can have a startup, but then the traction bit is kind of getting your first raise, and it may not be might be some family friends, but it's also some credible investors that can then get you to the next level. So again, CDL was really helpful, but it doesn't need to be CDL. It can be other venues, accelerators. CDL is nice because it's catered to professors and students coming out of the U of C, but you really need an audience. You need help to kind of distill your message down that it will appeal to investors, and so that's where we got help with multiple meetings, numerous meetings, and trying to get our message out there that then allowed us to get some traction and raise money.
So as somebody who's in the jungle still, I can say there's just perseverance. And sometimes you're just too soon, too early. And that's the beauty about actually working from academia, is that you can build the ideas. You can actually build the IP portfolio. You're not beholden to going out and doing the raise right away, because you do have this lab that is advancing a mission that we all believe in, that we're very passionate about. And so that gives you a lot of latitude and a lot of leeway. And so you just take advantage of it.
Yeah, I agree with, those experiences, and certainly one challenge that I've sort of focused on is how do you identify what the value of your doing is to the community, to investors, and how do you communicate that value in a way that they understand, all right? And investors look at things from a different perspective and a different lens, let alone other supporters in the community. But I think part of the opportunity as researchers is having that time to before you even begin to commercialize. And I think part of the process here is just that we're thinking in our research, is this something that's worth commercializing? Is it something that isn't? Because you don't want to just commercialize things. You want to commercialize things because it's beneficial to do that for whatever reason. And I think having an understanding of what your value is to communicate that is such a first step, but it's also a process. Sometimes you don't figure that out until much later in the process, depending on what you're doing and what kind of technology. So it is complicated, and it is a very difficult process, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, in a practical sense too, sometimes you start a startup, but now you're eligible for some of the academic industry funding that can really help give a second avenue to your lab that you can funnel right into the commercialization aspects of your research. There's the UC program, there's other programs that you're not going to be eligible for until you formed a startup. So it's a bit of a chicken and the egg, but you get the startup, and sometimes getting that traction is just going for those initial academic industry partnerships to raise money to focus on that commercialization side. That's what I'd add to it. Any other questions from the audience? We're hoping for lots. I saw your hand first. Yeah, sure. That's great.
There we go. There's the entrepreneurial ecosystem. There's people who are willing to invest. There are people who have the business acumen. And then there's the scientific community. There are people who have the brilliant ideas. What does the interface between the two look like in your eyes? How do you see them coming together? Like, if you wanted an entrepreneurial ecosystem to interact with your ecosystem, what would that interface look like to you?
So what does the interface look like between the academic and industrial commercialization ecosystems, and how are they connected?
Yeah.
Anyone want to take that?
That's a really good question, and it's almost something you have to talk to people. And the more people you talk to, the more connections you'll make, and the more meetings you'll have. It's going to take a whole lot of time, but it's really important to talk to people. And I remember one of the first things that we did was talk to David Park, and he connected us with some individuals, really helpful, people in industry, and it was just amazing to be able to have those connections. Some of them led places, others didn't, but in general, the more connections you have, the more likely you're going to benefit from them.
Yeah, I would tackle it in a slightly different manner, and I think that when you have a science-heavy company, I think that the academic needs to drive the company for a significant amount of time. I think that if you have other types of companies, that might not necessarily be the case. But I know I've been raising funds. I've talked to a lot of investors. The level and depth of questions that are required, it's about the science. It's not about our business plan. At least I'm in a small molecule biotech space, and so we're very heavy biotech. And so I think that interface between the academic developing the technology and the business people kind of to run the company forward, I think that's skewed differently when you are in a biotech company, quite frankly, in a life science company in this manner. I do get a lot of questions from investors about, gee whiz, we wish you had pharma experience, or we wish you were a seasoned CEO, You know, I tell anybody who will listen to me that, trust me, I'll hand this off as soon as I can, that, you know, I'm not having some rockin' time here with the fundraise. But I do think I'm the right person to fundraise. I believe that very firmly, that I'm the one that knows the technology. I understand its capabilities. I can speak directly to not only all the controls and experiments we've done, but the potential for the future. And I think to sell the company, I think I have to do that, as painful as it is at times. And then I think that once we get through this round, I really do think then it's more of a business execution exercise, and then somebody else can take over. So I do think, depending on the type of company you have, at what point you need that expertise at the table or not.
We even heard some of that from the Amylyx guys today. Josh and Justin are kind of the headliners of this event. They've done, I think, 700 million raised, but they're still, you know, being very successful with the science and them leading even during the fundraisers. So I think speaks to what you're saying also.
So I kind of understood the question a little bit differently, so my answer may or may not be relevant. They're not two distinct worlds, and I think that's something we have to kind of get our head around. In academia, we kind of think of commercialization as a dirty word, and something that we really shouldn't be thinking about, but really what you're doing is you're strategizing so that you're generating impact, you're generating value. And so, you know, starting to recognize that those conversations are not two different worlds. They understand the science very well. My experience so far with the business world is that these are very smart people that read the room very quickly and get to the point very quickly. So it's an interesting learning curve to see that they're not two different worlds. They actually get the science, and they yeah.
And I would just add that, you know, we have different types of technologies and discoveries at Hotchkiss: drugs, devices, diagnostics, digital tools. And I think importantly, while we are innovating in what we are doing in our research, we're not creating a new process here, right? You know, the world commercializes. The world, you know, if you go to Stanford, if you go to MIT, if you go to some of these leading centers, you know, this is a given, right? Like it is and not everything is commercialized there, because that's not necessary. But I think part of the understanding is that there are pathways, there are people who know, there is expertise, and regardless of how smart anybody may be or how successful, that you're going to have so many gaps in your knowledge of what to do, that the key will be bringing in people. Trust becomes a major factor. Who do you trust? And who do you want to partner with? Because these are big commitments. But importantly, we like to think there's great resource at the Hotchkiss, just to even have conversations and learn from people's experience, the people on the stage, you know, the mistakes we've made and what not to do. You know, I've got lots of those, but you know, so I think it's important to put that in context, and I love this concept of, you know, if you reach out, most people will help, and it is true. It is absolutely true. Most people like to share their experience, and the other piece is just learning from books. Like, you know, people who have been successful love to write about it because it's exciting to them, and they want others to be successful as well. And so it's incredible what you can just find by looking, you know, in different places. So I think, you know, and I do think of commercialization as that long tail of research, you know, when it's appropriate. And so I do think of it as a seamless way, but we also have to interact with the highest ethics, transparency, managing conflict of interest, all those things that are important as academics and as entrepreneurs.
Yeah, go ahead.
So at the Coming School of Medicine, what can we do better to support innovation and entrepreneurship? It's no longer. Very good, I'll stop yelling. So at the Cummings School of Medicine, what can we do better to support our researchers? You know, as you say, entrepreneurship is no longer a dirty word. What supports are needed for our researchers at the Cummings School? Because we're looking at strategic planning, looking at investments. What would support CSM? We've got CDL on main campus. That's, you know, that's one piece. But what could we do better at CSM? Thanks. I'll pass it on to the dean.
Yeah, you know, that's a great question, and I think there are things that can be done. One thing is, you know, potentially even connect the community to what's going on at the university, to make, you know, especially investors, people who want to deploy capital and you know, who are interested in specific, you know, disease processes. You know, a lot of people out there have interest in diseases because their family member has it, or their family member has MS or something like that, but they have no idea about what's going on at the Cummings School of Medicine to try to help that problem. And so I think if we were able to connect people, even patients and the community, to researchers, that would be very beneficial.
My answer is quite simple, and it's money. I think that's really, I know there's USEED, I think that goes a long way, but it's a couple $100K, and I think we need to get to a couple million to really get that branch from academic startup to really making a go at this. I think that it requires a lot of money through the valley of death, and I think that earlier when I was raising my seed round, investors would say, well, why don't you just go write a grant? And I would say, trust me, if I could, I would. Like, it would be a much easier process. I know how to write a grant like that, to come and talk to you guys and figure out the pitch and what you want to hear and be told it's too early. I would do the grant if I could, but at some point as you start to commercialize, it's no longer a hypothesis-driven project. You leave hypotheses behind, and you now move towards execution. And I think that the first step as you leave hypotheses behind is in the 200K range. And I think as you go through that and you move and you show promise, the next step is in the couple million range. And then from there, you can go out and raise a 5 million seed and then a larger Series A. I think it's that understanding that timeline, especially in again, I'm a small molecule biotech, so my dollar sizes are bigger. But I think that getting through that valley it requires significant money.
Yeah, I don't have any real suggestions to add to that. Money would be great. But even just the fact that I was at the point where I was about to publish this and kill this great idea, until I thought, well, I should probably ask David if I should patent this. I should probably find out if that's worth doing, if it's how hard it is. And if you're coming at it purely from an academic standpoint, you may not even know that that's a viable option, or that you are going to kill your idea if you publish it, without trying to create a vehicle for someone to extract value from it and to bring it to market and get it to people. And that's just something that is not taught in medicine, because we are noble and selfless, and commercialization is a dirty word. But it really isn't, and it's the only way to actually get these products to the patients who need them.
I look at a lot of the challenge that we have ahead of us, when you compare to the very successful centers around the world. There's some low-hanging fruit opportunities, and I think events like this are very powerful in terms of just speaking about and kind of normalizing that this is an admirable process to go through, and kind of demystifying it, because there's stigma around it, and that's a shame. I think top-down demystification works well, in terms of sort of being clear that this is a goal, one of the goals, not the only goal, but is something that's celebrated and supported and recognized. I think in terms of our, whether it's an AMHSP, whatever the arrangements are, that you can have time to do this kind of work if there are outcomes of value to the community, to the university, to the faculty. I think I like this concept of, if you want to innovate, you have to innovate the process of innovating, and because often the barriers are unnecessary and self-induced that we all have. And so I think there's some pretty straightforward thing, but I think at HBI what we found is talking more about it is helpful. More people get involved, the voice gets louder, and then here we are today, and I think that's pretty straightforward, right? Without even changing major policies and things like this. So I think there's some sort of opportunity to kind of, and I think this is part of that journey for all of us, right? In terms of how do we build our community. I think Calgary's had tremendous success in tech, but I think biotech is very much emerging. We're very much, and I think sometimes it's a bit conflated, in terms of what's biotech and what's tech, and sometimes there's a bit of overlap. But I think we need to kind of do our bit to kind of elevate our community in that regard. And I think, connecting us globally to opportunities, whether it's scientific or investors, I think we'd all take any help we can get, right? So that's for sure.
Done.
So, Imani asks, most of the Canadian IP techs tend to move to the U.S. As a scientist entrepreneur building your startups, what do you reckon is the biggest reason for that, and how do you tackle that? They're going to repeat the question.
Yes.
So basically, you know, a lot of tech startups will go to the U.S. And what is the reason for that? Is that just the question? So, yeah, when I think of it, yeah, I mean, we have lots of opportunities right here in Canada. I think a lot of people will go to the U.S. I'm not sure that their chance of success is necessarily higher. A lot has to do with the ecosystem and where they're actually going. But I feel like Canada's ecosystem, and Calgary in particular, fosters this right now. I'm not sure there's anywhere else in North America that you'd actually want to be right now if you had a tech startup. Because we're all just exploring, and there's a lot of resources being put into trying to make these startups a success here. It's pretty cutthroat in the US. Capital's there. That's probably the biggest reason why they go down to the US. We explored that with our business early on. Should we go down to the US? Should we have a satellite there? Would it make it easier to raise US funds there? Possibly, but we decided against it. You know, it's actually, you know, here is where we wanted to be. We wanted to do something novel out of Canada. We wanted to show that it's possible to do it, right, you know, out of Calgary and put out a high-risk implantable medical device that has not been done before. So, yeah, I would say capital is probably the reason, but it certainly can be done from here.
Well, I'm sorry to disagree, but I think, so I'm raising a large Series A, and I have a signed term sheet with several investors committed in the round. We're just close to wrapping this thing up. And one of the criteria for this term is that the company has to leave Calgary. And so I think, and it's because the investors deem it risky to put this amount of money into a company in an ecosystem that is nascent. And so I think that we don't do ourselves any disservice to pretend otherwise. I think that there's a lot of promise in Calgary. I think everything you just said is completely true. I think that University of Calgary has put a lot of effort and energy. Innovate Calgary, Hotchkiss Brain Institute, Cummings School of Medicine. There's a lot of movement towards biotech and tech, generally speaking, here in Calgary. But on the biotech side, we're still growing, and it's deemed questionable whether we can get access to the talent and we can get access to the equipment and the type of services we need to really take a small molecule from a lab and into a person, a new small molecule. It needs all the safety and whatnot. And so I think that we need to continue to build. We have work in front of us. I don't think we can underestimate the U.S. I'm American, so I can say it myself. They're very selfish, very self-centered. They don't like to look north of the border if they don't have to. And so I think that that capital that is in the States generally doesn't come north to Canada. We have to work very, very hard to get it. And so I think that we have to continue to grow and build and show what we're doing. And we're not there yet, but we're hungry, and I think we will get there, but I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, so Salveston is based out of Delaware for that very reason, because it's a lot easier to raise capital in the U.S.
You know, I had a recent conversation with a chief medical officer of a biotech. They had just closed a $100 million round. They were based out of Europe, but the chief medical officer was in Boston because they were told to open an office, and that was a condition of the money, and have a local chief medical officer. And I think that's not a Calgary issue, that's an everywhere issue. And I think the way we counteract that, you know, we have a nice slide for Hotchkiss when we share what we're doing in terms of all the advantages of setting up shop in Alberta. You know, the excellence in clinical trials at the University of Calgary, at the School of Medicine, you know, the favorable taxation, the much lower cost of running a clinical trial, you know, whether it's just the currency or even just the per item that you're doing per patient is much cheaper than at most centers in the U.S., I think in all centers in the U.S. So there's attracting factors, but we're not there yet. And I think we need to build the ecosystem to just protect the IP from just leaving, because it will go where it needs to go. And I think that's actually part of the process for researchers and scientists. But I think, you know, helping address some of those more systemic issues, you know, is maybe something else the faculty can help with, because that requires all the stakeholders. And I think there's a point where there's critical mass and that we don't have to leave. And I think that should be the goal, because otherwise, you know, what you do see is, you know, I think, and you're going to hear this from Josh and Justin today, in a short time, 5,000 biotechs setting up shop in Boston, and then the continued growth of that, and that IP is coming from somewhere, right? And I think it is a competition in many ways, and so we need to facilitate success based here, right? And I think companies will have to open offices in different places, but I think to be headquartered here is very attractive to people. So. Yeah.
Maybe just add one thing. One of the things that we often forget is that there's a lot of non-dilutive capital in Canada, and that's not something that's very easy to access elsewhere. It's pretty unique to the Canadian ecosystem, so a reason to stay as well.
It isn't an event unless we have AV issues, so sorry about that.
I just had a question regarding funding. So obviously there's a traditional way of acquiring funding for research. Do you think that the application process for grants with funding organizations needs to adapt to like the commercialization side of things and patenting, or do you think kind of keep that separate, keep the research aspect separate and leave the investing to the investors, or what kind of cross-collaboration do you think there needs to be? And if so, is there a percentage that needs to be improved upon? Because right now I know it's probably quite disproportionate.
I think you're going to see a theme to my answers, and it comes down around to money. So I think that something the U.S. does well is their SBIR, STTR competitions. Small business, I don't know, innovation research, I don't know what it stands for. And you can get $1 to $2 million in their SBIR round, and you can get in their round one, and then you can get upwards of 10 or 15, I think, maybe 20, in their second round. And this is all government funds run through the NIH. So CIHR, which is our version, right, for those of you not in academic, of tri-council government funding bodies. And so they have a commercialization panel that funds around $200,000 like total. So, you know, I think that we've got a money problem in terms of helping us get these technologies, again, that are early stage, when they are still somewhat hypothesis-driven or maybe just leaving that stage and moving them forward. And so I do think that that CIHR, I'm going to call them out on this one, I think they could up the value of that and have it be in the $1 to $2 million range, and then I think we start to have a government program that really enables us to commercialize. Other than that, I don't think that the other programs that CIHR runs or the other tri-council agencies or the foundations, I don't think they collectively need to get together and help, you know, change the way they do business. I think the way they do business fuels all of this. So I think that's fine. But I do think CIHR could up that dollar amount on a grant that the government can help get you. And it takes some pressure off Bev Adams here, who has to come up with a couple $1 million after I just told her that.
Yeah, I mean, there are funding opportunities that do fill in some of the gaps, but not all of them. There's, you know, IRAP, MyTax. You know, MyTax helps with students, it's matching funds. IRAP also matching funds, you know, but mainly focused in, you know, to spend it in Canada. And there are, you know, difficulties. We find a few difficulties with that. There's some things that we just can't do in Canada. We have to go to the US and we can't spend funds, IRAP funds on those. And it's not like all of a sudden they'll give you $1 or $2 million. You have to kind of work your way up from 50,000 and then maybe double it the next time. And so there is, I agree, there's a big gap in terms of funding for high risk, high reward type commercializable activities.
You know what, I think ultimately there needs to be a shift in the perspective in that artificial barrier between research and commercialization. Now there are barriers. There are, conflict of interest. You have to declare your interests. And those are all extremely appropriate, and we should be held to the highest standards at all times. But the best outcome of a great discovery is that it helps people. And so I think, that thinking needs to evolve a little bit in terms of some of the rules and policies. But you need to balance that without, you don't want people, misusing grants for the wrong purposes or for what they were not intended. But I do think there's an evolution that has to happen here, not for all research funding, but for enough that it makes sense for the community.
Oh, I think we have a question up. Oh, hey, Sid.
So what does work back with the university mean?
Do you work with the university to a certain extent as a company, not as a faculty?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I would say this particular university is very encouraging and supportive of commercialization and of pursuing the entrepreneurial path. They didn't make it difficult at all. In fact, they were quite encouraging. They have a number of different programs that have already been mentioned. So USEED is a big one. A number of other things, Innovate Calgary, for example, that'll help guide you through all of the different steps. There are things that need to be done better, but I would say that it's very helpful and very supportive, and never left the university. So.
Yeah, I think the university did actually quite a lot for us in terms of when we were starting. Through Innovate Calgary and USEED. Right when we were starting, fortunately, Innovate Calgary had, there was a change in kind of how much you would have to kind of give to the university if you were going to start a business. If they were to provide you with help patenting and things like that, it might be a little bit more. But overall, we found, and we compared it to a lot of other institutions around North America, was much more favorable than a lot of other places. So I think the university did a lot from that perspective. What might help in continuing this and in kind of fostering the startups that come out and actually allowing the startups to then fund, further fund labs at the university. For instance, our startup actually, still funds my research program through a certain account. And so we do a lot of studies, we do a lot of commercializable R&D activities in my lab. And one thing they could help with is actually reducing the overhead, because it's a pretty significant overhead. So I would say that would be a really nice thing if the overhead came down, because in the end it's going to benefit the university anyway, if this is a success. So dropping that and giving us a bit of a break on that would be great.
The only thing I'll add is to tackle the last part of your question, because I think it's an interesting assumption, which is that we leave the university, go do our entrepreneurial pursuits, and then maybe we wander our way back or don't. And it's a debate, because we don't leave the university, actually. We stay in our roles at the university while we go do these entrepreneurial activities. And it cuts both ways. The university can start to wonder, how distracted are we? But also the venture capital, if you're trying to raise funds, can ask questions about how much time do you have for this? And so I do think that the university is very generous in the time allocation. But I think there could be more of a discussion around, should us entrepreneurs be taking leaves of absences? and pursuing them, would it A, help with fundraising, and B, is it appropriate to do, and then after a year or two decide. It's a conversation that is just now starting, actually.
I think we're going to try and get through 2 more questions before we wrap up. Go ahead.
What do you wish non-academics knew about working with academic founders? And maybe a different way of asking that question is, what are the pain points that you've had that, I mean, is it, you know, getting access to different skill sets, product or software engineering or data science, or finding a co-founder, or is it always just about money? And one point, actually, Dr. Crash, you might be interested that the Business Council of Alberta actually in their policy plank recommends creating a Made in Alberta SBIR program. So there is an election coming up here, so if everybody kind of got on this and kept on pushing that, that actually might happen, because there's a couple $2 billion going to the Heritage Trust Fund, and that would be a damn good use for it.
Fully agree. Well, I guess inside the mic. So I think that, you know, I don't know where to start. I think that the bottom line is, I think it'd be nice if academics were given a little bit more credit. I think that we are smart, and I think we're capable. And I think we're more capable than is initially assumed. I think that they think that we sit in our labs and we wait for an apple to fall from the tree and we have some epiphany about, gosh, maybe this protein is interesting, and then we kind of lollygag our way through the hills as we think about it. And it's like, you know, that is just not what happens. Like, our labs are businesses. Like, we come to work, we have productivity and milestones and objectives. We call them different things. We call them progress reports instead of, you know, milestones, but they're the same thing. And so I do think that we are quite entrepreneurial as professors. We have to start a lab from nothing. We have to get it going. We have to find every single dollar that's come through the lab, I've had to raise myself. Every single one. And so I think if anybody is worth betting on, I think it's a professor. And we come out the gate with a bias that I would like to see go away. I would like to see our natural entrepreneurial tendencies be valued.
Yeah, I think coming out of an academic institution, raising capital, it can be a disadvantage, right? Because people, the investors, as you mentioned, will say, you've got other priorities, this is one thing that you're doing. Universities don't commercialize well, right? So if you're handing it over to a seasoned team, that's different from if you're trying to do it yourself. And I think that needs to change, because I agree, I think it's completely inaccurate. I think there's been tremendous examples of tremendous successes, you know, where the scientists, even the CEO, to the point that they're a publicly traded company, to the point that, you know, they've generated tremendous value and impact. You know, you think of Abcelera in Vancouver as a great example, you know, of that. But yeah, it can be frustrating, and so I think the way we do that is show success. In the end, in this business, in commercialization, in venture, in taking science into impact, success is what matters. So I think as universities develop track records that are more impressive and more linked to the activity of the university, and I think part of that is having that ownership of success of the companies, then I think that will shift. But you know, sometimes it's a bit mind-boggling, actually.
Question from here? Is that both? Sure. Go ahead. I think we have time.
So I'd like to ask the panelists to comment on the role of the customer in all of this, right? There's clearly no shortage of, I mean, really impressive innovation on a campus like this. But the big customers for most of those innovations, right, that'll turn it into a real growth company, probably aren't in Calgary, right? They're probably not even in Alberta. They're likely in other parts of Canada or the US or other parts of the world. And the big investment dollars to make all this happen tend to reside in those same geographies where the big customers are. So it's like you kind of got to leave the university and kind of leave town to raise money and build your company, because you got to be closer to your customer. Or could you do it all here?
I mean, I think that's true to an extent. You know, we thought that initially as well as we were, you know, starting out, but you know, we managed by our, you know, seed round to actually get 2 US VCs to invest in us. And we're up here in the north, and one of the VCs that invested in us is one of the US's best and largest medtech VCs. So they invested in us. I don't think, they didn't have any issues with us being in Canada. They, at a certain stage, we may have to go down south to be closer to that customer, and they've had lots of exits, so we haven't had any pushback from them so far, and we're here up in the great white north.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the key issues that differentiate, to some extent, it's not perfect separation, but tech from biotech, right? I mean, if you have a med tech, you're developing a medical device, you're developing a diagnostic test, you're developing a digital tool, much like our company Lumio, you need customers to pay for your product. So that customer discovery process is critical. You need to understand if what you're doing has value and who's going to pay for it, who's going to buy it, and how is that all going to work. And then you need to validate that, and then you'll get money from investors, the whole concept of product market fit. Biotech, although it's a bit different, because when you do a market analysis to understand where is the unmet need, I can tell you, ALS, we have massive, and you're going to hear a story today about catastrophic unmet need. And so if you can develop your therapeutic, if it can be effective and safe and approved, there's a market, right? And we can predict those. There is heavy research involved in confirming that and understanding that and getting a sense of, what is your development pathway? How is it going to impact your regulatory filing? How is it going to affect your market access so patients can actually have access to it, which is always a priority. But each of those spheres, whether it's a drug or a device or a cell therapy, they do work differently. And so having an ecosystem that can support each of those, because sometimes if you're a drug developer in a room of tech entrepreneurs, you're not talking about the same thing, and vice versa, right? And so I think part of what we're trying to do is grow our network to really have the best in the world to help us understand, like, does this small molecule have value in this disease, and what is the pathway to get there in a way that's actually investable. And it comes back to what we were talking about, right, in terms of how do you then package that so people can understand it and invest in it, because our language is sometimes quite different from the investor's language, right? But I think it's an important point. Customer discovery, understanding that is critical, and actually lends well to the research process as well. Often people blend that in together, but that's part of the challenge. Is our work is very diverse, and so sometimes things apply and sometimes they don't apply as much.
That's the sign that the Scientist Entrepreneur panel is over. I'd like to give it up for all the speakers here. Thank you.
Hello? Oh, okay, it works, yay. We will take a 15-minute intermission at this point. Please grab a beverage, some bites. Again, both beverage are come on, Craig. If you Walsh a hard time, that's also okay. He's my okay.
So, hi everyone. Justin, one of the two co-CEOs and co-founders at Amylyx, along with Josh. So, Lawrence, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us here. We've been talking about this for a long time, so we're so thrilled, and it's really an honor to get to speak to everyone here. Maybe to start, I'll say that we got to tour the Hotchkiss Brain Institute today, and I think what you all have here is just sensational. We were saying that I think seeing true translational work and such an open entrepreneurial spirit, I think, is so rare to find, and I think it's so critical. It's made us even more excited to be here and get to talk with everyone. Lawrence, thank you for the very kind introduction, and Josh and I thought we'd start really how we started Amylyx and maybe share more on that side. we're coming up on our 10th year, our 10-year anniversary, which we're very excited about. And we're very proud of where we are today. But it wasn't all that long ago that we were where some of you are, probably even considerably earlier than where many of you are. So Josh and I were friends in college, and we, in short, thought we had a different way of looking at neurodegenerative diseases. And we came up with a mechanism of how we thought things might work. And it was really just a scientific interest. I'll say that from the sort of my personal side, it really started. Josh was doing a bunch of sort of research on his own and came and told me that he was working on this stuff, and I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever heard. And we sort of thought, well, heck, no one else is going to try this, so hey, why don't we start a company? And we look back, and I think we'll always smile when saying that, because we had no idea what we were doing. And no idea even what that meant. It sounded nice. To give you an example of how naive we were, we would go tell people that we have a company. And one day someone said, well, where are you incorporated? And we said, I don't know what you're talking about. And they said, well, if you're not incorporated, then you do not have a company. And so we had business cards, but the incorporation part had escaped us. The first several months of the company, our business plan was we thought we had a way to treat the mechanism that we had created. And we thought, well, simple. We'll buy the chemicals online. We'll buy a tabletop capsule machine. We'll make capsules. We'll put them in a bag. We'll walk down to the nearest hospital and we'll say, try this in your patients. And I swear to God, that was our business plan. And we would go to anyone who would listen and we would say, we're going to be in clinical trials in 3 months' time, and here's how we're going to do it, and what are we missing? And some people kindly said, well, have you considered, how are you going to know what dose? And well, you might want to have some preclinical experiments. Some people were not so nice. Some people said you should go get a real job. But I think what I hope we can share in some of our founding story is that I think in our opinion, it's a wonderful thing when you don't know what you're doing, because you ask questions that other people wouldn't, and sometimes you have perspectives that may have been overlooked, like I hope is the case with our treatment. But pass back to you.
So this is where, So once we had the idea, and the thought was, we had studied a lot about neuronal death, and that was kind of our goal with this compound. We wondered, how are we going to possibly take this thing forward? We had the initial business plan that was getting shut down very thoroughly, so we needed a path forward. And we ended up connecting with some scientists, and their initial point, which is a very good one, is you need data. We had a idea, we had a compounds that could potentially target this mechanism, but initially we didn't have data. It was just a theoretical idea that if you target these pathways, it would be a good idea, and here's why, and everything like that. And unfortunately, to get data, you need money. And so this kind of put us in a little bit of a chicken or the egg. The people we wanted money from wanted us to have data, and to get the data, we needed the money. So early on, we looked around our university. We both went to Brown University. And Brown at that time, they do now, but Brown at that time really didn't have any entrepreneurial resources, or very little. And Justin and I had never fundraised or anything. We didn't know what to do in this regard. So we ended up connecting with one of the professors at Brown who was running a kind of social justice center, and had a kind of grant opportunity for new startups that were trying to make social change. And we spoke to him and said, trying to treat ALS, that's social change. And he said, we're kind of more looking for like civil rights, like things like that. And we said, we get it, but we can't find any funding, and we really, really need help. And we ended up getting a grant from that, which was actually some of the first money in to the company, allowed us to run our first experiment and kind of get our first data. The other thing I'll say we learned pretty quick and early on, and I think this is true in pharma, but probably true in, frankly, any space, there is so much to know, and there's no way to know it all. I think a lot of people get scared away from entrepreneurship thinking, well, I don't know everything. I don't know everything about finance, everything about business, everything about science. How could I possibly do this? Well, the answer is you surround yourself with people who do. And so I'd say much of what we did for the first 6 months or so of the company was just trying to talk to people. We actually made we met a couple people, at the start we didn't have too much of a network, but we met a couple people through our professors, through family, through friends, and then at the end of every meeting we made a practice to always ask, can you give us 3 other people that we should meet? And we ended up making a big graph on a big sheet of paper that said, this one, introduced it to this one, introduced it to this one. And at the start, it wasn't too impressive. Eventually, the paper was overfilling. And so many of those people, you start hearing the same themes, the same opinions. This is how you should do your manufacturing. This is how you should take your next step. So I think that early networking is, one of the maybe instrumental parts in starting a company.
So to Josh's point, so when we heard that we needed data, we thought, okay, well, let's go try to find the smartest scientists that we could find. And so we were introduced to a professor at Harvard Mass General named Rudy Tanzi, who's one of the world's foremost Alzheimer's experts. And so we talked with Rudy, and Rudy thought, okay, guys, this is really cool, but you need data. And so we said, okay, well, we talked about experimental design, and so we came up with an experiment, which Rudy told us later, and again told Lawrence as well, that apparently he told us it because he thought, this will fail, and then they'll go back to grad school or something like that. And so we designed this experiment, and to Josh's point, we got the grant funding, which was $7,000, which for us at the time was everything. And we basically pitched it all in one experiment. And we realized also that we didn't have any credibility. So we tried to work with a contract research organization because we felt like, okay, if we work with a really high quality CRO, in this case it was Charles River Labs, it was all PhDs doing the work. They literally videotape all their experiments. So then people can't say, well, you guys just cooked something up. It was someone else who did the work. And so we did the experiment, and it worked. And it worked actually significantly better than the positive control. And it was basically just a model of neuronal death. And we showed that our drug is a combination of 2 small molecules, and we showed that using either one of these small molecules, you could prevent some of the cell death, but in combination, you could prevent nearly all of it. And so we came back and we told Rudy, we said, hey, here are the results. And I'll never forget, he just sort of stared at his computer, and we thought something was wrong because he just wouldn't talk. And we were like, hey, is everything okay? He's like, just give me a moment, just give me a moment. And finally he turned around and he said, guys, I don't know what you have here, but I want to make this happen. And so that was our first advisor we got. I think we realized, though, that having that early data would persuade someone, I think, very progressive like Rudy, but it was a far cry from a pharmaceutical. So it started this process of we would take the data and we'd go fundraise, usually like $5,000, $10,000 at a time, and then we'd run a couple experiments. Then we'd go back and we went through this process for almost 2 years. And so we called our seed financing about $2 million in total, but really it was a a series of what are called convertible notes, which there are, now people use safe notes. It's the same concept. But it was really just rolling. So we would raise a little money, do the experiments. Bank account was zero, go back. And so that was our process for almost 2 years. And but I think all along the way, as Josh said, what was really, really instrumental for us is we would constantly try to ask anyone who would listen to us, how do we turn this into a real treatment? What do we need to do to make this a reality? And I'll say, and happy to share stories if people are interested. Something I'm sure many of you know in the audience is when you're going off and doing something that maybe you don't have the experience to do or is a little atypical, it's not without its challenges. So we were so lucky that there were people who believed in us and took a chance and advised us and helped us understand how do you turn this into a pharmaceutical. There were many people who didn't. And so maybe one other point of advice, and I was so glad to hear it on the last panel a bit too, is you have to have confidence in yourself. And I think something Josh and I found from an early stage is I think having this balance between total humility, that you really don't know, in our case we literally didn't know anything, so it wasn't hard, but where I think it's so important to recognize that, especially when we're dealing with biology and health, there's so much to learn. There's infinite amount to learn. We can't possibly know it all. So I think having that understanding, but at the same time that confidence to keep going forward and to keep pushing, even when people tell you some not so nice things. I'll maybe tell one story and then pass to Josh. So one example was one investor we went to pitch to. We'd had many, many meetings, and this is how most of our meetings went. We'd have a meeting, they'd say, you're missing these 100 things. And we'd say, okay, and we'd go do those 100 things, and we'd come back and we'd say, hey, what about now? And they'd say, well, now you're missing these 20 things. And so we'd do this. And so finally, with one of these investors, we came back to him, and he said, guys, you got it all. You answered all the questions. You've got the advisors. You've got the data. You have some early funding. There's only one problem now. And we said, what? And he said, kids don't do drug development. And we said, what? He said, kids don't do drug development. And that was it. And then, so we're pretty mad because he spent a lot of our time. But that then kind of became a rallying cry for us. Kids don't do drug development. And so I'm glad to say we proved him wrong.
Yeah, and I'll probably share some more fundraising stories as well. Often it looks, you look back at it, oh, seed round, $2 million, and, subsequent rounds, how hard was that? We were, I would say during this time, pitching to anybody we could possibly pitch to. There were days we would have 5, 10 pitches in one day and just heard no over and over and over again. And I'd say, the process of hearing no as in a kind of investment pitch, it's actually much more drawn out. It would be lovely if at the end of the meeting they just said, no, I'm not interested. Instead, it's, thank you for the pitch. I'm going to talk to my firm. We have these questions. Can you give us a written response? You write 4 pages. That's interesting. Can we come in for another meeting? Okay, great. We'll do another meeting. And you go on and on down the line. But I'll share maybe some particular stories along Justin's line of some of the tougher ones. So one, we knew we didn't have much credibility. I mean, you almost can't imagine a worse investment thesis. 2 young guys who've never built a pharmaceutical company before, going after a disease, as Lawrence said, with 80 consecutive failures. Frankly, at the time too, the market wasn't even that good. So, literally nothing was encouraging about this in a way to an investor, right? I mean, nothing had the pattern that they typically look for. And one of the ways we tried to overcome that was asking many of the people who we had built in our network, do you mind if we can put you on a slide as advisor? And so we ended up having a very impressive slide of some pretty strong people in the biotech industry, and that was our first slide. Before we even talked about the technology or anything else, the first thing we said is, we work with these people. And people would be, okay, maybe I can take this a little seriously if they work with these people. But we were in one pitch. It was kind of a stand-up, in front of the group type of pitch. And we were on that first slide, and a guy stood up and said, I don't believe you meet with any of these people. And we said, yeah, no, we meet with them all the time. No, you don't. And we ended up arguing with this guy to the point of being like, here are all their cell phone numbers. Do you want me to call them right now? And this was one of these very timed pitches, so it was a 5 or 10 minute thing. Pretty much burned all our time. We got to like slide 3 and we left. You end up, that's a particular example, but you end up having a lot, that was probably, most of the pitches were more like that than not. But I think to Justin's point, it is this combination of humility and wanting to learn and knowing that you don't know and that you constantly need to ask questions and learn. And also confidence, and I think the confidence is confidence that this thing should move forward. And that, come hell or high water, this thing should move forward. Maybe you don't know everything, but patients are waiting and this thing needs to move forward. And I don't care if 50 people say no, the 51st person will say yes.
So the next critical milestone for us was we had the preclinical data, we were doing the toxicology work, it looked pretty good. And the question for us was, how do you bridge the translational gap? How do you go into a clinical trial? And again, we would meet with at this point it was mostly venture capitalists, and we would meet with everyone. And everyone would say the same thing, guys, I really hope you're successful, but I can't in good conscience put my money there. I can't go to my limited partners and say, we passed on this, exciting, spun out of blank university, immuno-oncology company platform, and we passed on that, but instead we invested in 2 guys who've never done this before, going after ALS with no platform. By the way, the IP situation, which we can talk about in a little bit, is also kind of wonky and weird, and I wish you all the luck in the world, but I can't put my money there. And so what was really transformational for us was we applied for, at the time, a translational grant through the US ALS Association and ALS Finding a Cure. And this was right after the Ice Bucket Challenge. So ALS finally had some more significant funding in it. And so a lot of the funding came from the Ice Bucket Challenge. And so we applied for the grant and we got it. And what was so transformational for us, one, it was for $3 million, which at the time was astronomical to us. But the other thing is that it gave us additional credibility. And so it's probably a theme you're hearing, is that I think certainly starting where we did, but I think generally continuing to build that credibility is so important, especially when you go out to the investment community. And what was so great is that we could then go out to investors and say, okay, maybe you don't believe us, but some of the leaders in the field have said that this is one of the most promising ideas in ALS, and it started to change the dynamic. The other thing we found, and this was for our Series A, is that through that process, it really forced us to find investors who first of all believed in us, and secondly, I think really shared our values and vision. And what I mean by that is that I think probably more traditional investors who were looking for a certain path and a certain step up from place to place and a certain amount of de-risking, we were not a fit for that. But for investors who thought, okay, maybe there's a low probability of success here, but I think they're trying to do something important, and if it does work, what an amazing humanitarian value that would have. And I think that those were the investors that we saw eye to eye with. And so in our Series A, we were led by a group called Morningside, who all of the funds come from one family, and the Chan family. And Gerald and his family care tremendously that whatever they invest in has an impact on bettering the world. and particularly in healthcare and biotechnology. And so they led our round. There's a newly formed group called the ALS Investment Fund, or mission-focused venture fund in the Netherlands, and we were their first investment. And then our third largest investor was Henry Termeer. Henry has sadly passed away, but Henry was the longtime CEO of Genzyme, which is a company that in many ways pioneered treatments for people with rare disease. And so I think these were all people who cared deeply about our mission and believed that even if there's a low probability of success, if they're successful, this will really, really make an impact. And I think that having that group of foundational investors gave us, again, the credibility and the confidence to try to go out and do this the right way. And so with that funding, we were then able to go into our first significant clinical trial, the Centaur trial.
Sure. And maybe, one story as we were going into Centaur, and I want to be conscious of time too. Do we have to, okay, just let me know if we have to wrap. But while we were going, towards the Centaur trial, we had just raised the Series A, $5 million on top of the $3 million grant. We were, very, very excited. We had all the budgets and path lined up from then to the completion of the trial. Everything was planned.
We could take actual salaries.
We started taking salaries, like everything was great. And, one of the things we had to do was manufacture enough drug for this clinical trial. And, Justin and I learned everything we could, asked as many people as we could. We had some consultants helping us, but we hadn't manufactured a drug before, certainly not at that scale. And to run Centaur, we needed about 400 kilograms of drug, is kind of what it added up to be. And so in any case, we talked to the firm who manufactures the drug, and they said, a batch costs this much, and it kind of doesn't matter if it's 10 kilograms, 20 kilograms, 100 kilograms. It kind of doesn't matter because most of the cost is in setup and cleanup. It's a little cheaper to do it smaller, but it kind of doesn't matter. Say, okay, we'll make it all in one. We'll just make 400 kilograms all together, et cetera. And people who know our drug, Albrioza in Canada, it's a white powder. We made this batch and it came out black. The machine had overheated and cooked all of the drug. And this batch cost us $400,000 to $500,000. We no longer had a business plan that could get us through the clinical trial. Not a great situation. I mean, for us, and this was maybe 2 months after closing the Series A. It was the thing had literally just closed, and we now did not have enough money to execute on the plan that we had, told people. So I think a couple things that were really stressful here. One is, how do you communicate that? How do you go back to your investors and say, it didn't go as planned, right? We've had a problem. We theoretically need to make a new batch, and the new batch might be burned too, because we're not even 100% sure we figured out the root cause and fixed it, and we only have so much money to try to throw towards fixing that, root cause and everything like that. But I'd say what ended up happening was first, we were in the Netherlands visiting the investor who had helped with our round during the time we got the news about this manufacturing lot. And we ended up being scheduled to visit with a person living with ALS who was, kind of could only communicate through eye gaze. People with ALS become paralyzed, so eventually they communicate kind of by typing with their eyes. And walking into this meeting, all I could think about is the batch, right? During the meeting, this individual, his name was Hans van Soest in the Netherlands, was really funny guy, kept us laughing the whole time, told amazing stories about his life. And I remember walking out of there just thinking, my problems are nothing, right? If this individual living with ALS can put on a smile, make me laugh, then this batch is nothing. And I think that really kind of inspired us to call the investors, do what we needed to do. We reopened a round. We ended up raising another $2.5 million to basically cover things. The next time we made the drug, we made it in 10 batches of 40. Maybe a little excessive on the other side, but it worked. And actually all 10 worked. None of them burned. But, maybe just, and we can jump into how we ran the trial, but I thought it was a good story just to hear that, the best laid plans, almost always have some sort of roadblock or hiccup along the way.
And I think one general thing for us has been that at every, we try to stay very close to the community, to the ALS community, and especially to people with the disease. And I have to say that at every turn, whenever we've had a challenge, you meet, I mean, Lawrence, you know this better than we do. You meet the most amazing people, and they're so strong and so selfless often, and it just reminds you of what's at stake here. And I think for us, that's one of the most beautiful things about working in the space we are, and I know like many of you are, is that at the end of the day, if we succeed, we help people who really need it and deserve it. And I think that for us, the other piece of staying confident even in the face of adversity is remembering why you're doing this. And I think, at least for us, that's really always seen us through. We ran the Centaur clinical study. It was a 25-center study. And by the way, at the time, we were a 3-person company, so 2 of us and 1 other person. And we wanted to keep the company very small because the last thing we wanted was to overpromise. Sadly, there's been a lot of failure in ALS, and we really didn't want to have a situation where we went out and had all this hype and then it didn't work. So in late 2019, we managed to finish the study, and then very late, right before American Thanksgiving, at like almost midnight, we had a call with our statistics vendor, and it worked. The study met its pre-specified primary outcome. It showed a statistically significant slowing of the disease as measured by the gold standard rating scale. And over time, we then followed people long-term, and we saw that there was also an overall survival benefit of the treatment. So it slowed progression and people lived longer. And it's the first time in ALS that we've seen a treatment be able to do both things. So the question then for us was, well, you can't, 3 people, there's only so many hours in the day.
7 at that point.
Well, sorry, we were 7 people at that point, but there's only so much you can do. And we realized that either the option was partner with a large company or try to do it ourselves. And I think, again, we thought to ourselves, on the negative side, if we gave this over to a big company who didn't care the way that we do about this community and about trying to do right by the community, we would never forgive ourselves. And then on the other hand, we felt like, what if we could find like-minded people who really want to be part of a mission to help people in a community that really need it? I think we could really do something great. And so we set off on this kind of crazy mission to find a bunch of people and basically try to build a company. At the end of 2019, we were 7. And then by the end of 2020, we were 26. And then by the end of 21, we were 110. And then by the end of last year, we were a little over 250, and now we're about 300. So it's been quite a rocket ship from there. But I think, and we also went public, and we had quite a public regulatory path last year, which we're happy to talk about. But I think that maybe a few messages that I hope we can share is that, one, I'd say that, to really state it, we had no idea what we were doing at the beginning. And in many ways, we think, looking back, that was a gift, because we could go ask people the dumb questions, and nobody was surprised. We could ask, why do things have to be done this way? for example, in our clinical trial, we went straight to a study that would show basically if the drug worked or not. And I remember several investigators, very experienced people, called us up and they said, guys, you realize this is it. Like, if this doesn't work, like, you're done. And we said, yeah, that's the point. And so I think that's, one thing looking back that we're really proud of. I think the second thing, and I think this is, again, like I said, one of the really beautiful things of working in the area we're in and the area that so many of you are in as well, is I think that there's such a great alignment of our success as a business and really helping people that need it. And I have to say that through all the trials and tribulations and challenges and growth, we wake up every day feeling so lucky to get to do what we do. And I think it's particularly in those tough times, and there will always be more, that having that sort of mission just both keeps you grounded and keeps you at it. So I think that's probably it, and happy to take questions.
Thank you both. That's fantastic. What we had planned was about a 30-minute fireside chat with me asking deeply insightful questions and you guys providing, of course, deeply insightful answers. But I think we've seen so much engagement tonight that maybe I could just ask one or two very focused questions that I think people will have on their minds, and then we'll go straight to the audience. So the first is, you had mentioned earlier, it took about 100 pitches to get one investor, right? That was sort of the ratio at first. How did you get 100 pitches, right? So any tips or tricks in terms of opening those doors? Because often you're sending your deck by email to like a info at whatever the investor is. I think if you're fortunate, people and you're leveraging. But in terms of like accessing a capital network, leveraging it, leveraging relation, like how did you guys approach that, and what would you share?
Yeah, great question. First I'd say it's a full court press. You use everything you got to get those meetings, to get those investors. I'd say first think about the people who are going to know investors. One of our key people who made a ton of intros was our lawyer. And of course, your lawyer, if they've done deals in your space, if they've done work in your space, is going to know a ton of people. Your accountant's going to know a ton of people. Your investors are going to know a ton of people. That's maybe not true in the first round, but by your second round, you can ask your investors to meet investors. Even those investors who say no, it's still worth asking them. Can you make an intro to others? I'd also say, we in later rounds, in the early round we didn't do this, but in later rounds would actually start our pitches with the investors we least wanted. And the reason we would do that was just for practice, right? You go to those investors that gave you a terrible feeling in the last round, were totally rude, and you go back to them just to hear what they have to say. And you take notes and you talk to your co-founder or otherwise after and say, were any of those good points? Like, should we change our deck? Should we do some additional science experiments? Whatever it might be. But, I'd say overall it's, and then obviously your network too. All the different people you go out to meet to learn about manufacturing or toxicology or whatever it might be. They might know some investors too. I just say ask everybody, and that's kind of how you get in front of them. And maybe I'm probably going on long, but the last thing I'll say is that Justin said it a lot. It's all about kind of the building blocks of credibility, and investors are inundated with these pitches, and they have to figure out which ones they're going to go for, and that can take a lot of forms. It can mean that somebody they know has recommended you. It can mean your science, your data. It can mean your background. It can mean all sorts of things put together that story of credibility in front of an investor. And it even starts, I would generally avoid the info ads. It generally starts with the intro, right? Who introduces you does carry weight.
Maybe one other thing I would say is don't be afraid to pitch, and really to anyone. Pitch and pitch and pitch. And I'll say that for us, the way that we knew that we had pitched enough was we would be in a meeting with investors, and before they had gotten halfway through their question, we were both biting our tongues because we knew what they were going to ask. Because I'll say there are only so many questions in the world. And if you get to enough people, it is very rare that you get a question you haven't heard before. And I think that adds to the credibility. The other thing that I think is really important is to try to go to investors when you're not raising capital. That was one of the great pieces of advice we got. We had a couple advisors, including one in a very well-known venture group, and he was such a great advisor for us, especially at an early stage, because there was no way he was going to invest in us, and it was very understood. And so he could give us some very just unfiltered advice. And one of the things he said is, talk to investors when you're not raising money. He said, when you come in and you're raising a round, I'm clutching my wallet. I know you're here for one reason. When you're coming in and you're not, it's, I hope, for my advice. You want to actually hear what I have to say. And I think that was such great advice, and so we really made a habit of that. But just in terms of the persistence, I'll share 2 quick stories. So one, we learned recently, so our drug was FDA approved on September 29th. And we heard through a couple of contacts that on September 29th, there was a venture capital gala in Boston. And apparently the talk anyone would talk about is how every single one of them said no to Amlex. So to give you an idea, and maybe one other, so we had a really excellent group join us in our crossover round, our Series C. And at the end of it, we went out for drinks to celebrate. And the principal who did the deal, he said, I have to tell you guys something really funny. I brought this to the investment committee, and we keep track of every single company who's been to the investment committee, and then we keep track of the small few that we've done investments in. And we mark them down with a number, and that's how many times they've been to the investment committee. And he said, we were looking at the columns, and you guys were 2, which meant that he said, guys, we were a 4, which meant that we had been to the investment committee 4 times, and on the 4th go around, they invested. And he said to everybody, hey, guys, I think this is the first 4 we've ever had. And they all laughed. They said, we don't even have a 2. So to the point, just keep pushing and keep pitching. And, again, going back to that confidence thing, even if the answer is no today, it might be different tomorrow.
Wonderful, thank you. The other focal question I want to make sure we cover is the bit we haven't talked about tonight is that you identified a pathway and then identified 2 generic therapies, 2 generic small molecule drugs that targeted those pathways, and then you combined them. Conventional wisdom in Calgary, and I would say across Canada, is that you cannot build value, you cannot protect a generic drug. And the challenge we have at Hotchkiss, and probably more broadly, is that many of the initial discoveries, whether there's a pathway or a new target, is a generic drug. That's the first line. And of course, that's infinitely easier to develop in some ways than a new chemical entity, which will take years longer. So any advice you have for a scientist who has a discovery, a new target, they want to use a generic drug, and any advice or motivation maybe for them to proceed?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'd say just high level, we feel strongly where there's a will, there's a way. And I will say it made it hard, especially from a financing perspective. But I would say what we did early on is we got really good IP lawyers who understood what we were trying to patent and protect. And they came to the conclusion that you guys have taken 2 drugs and you've repurposed them and combined them, and you've found a surprising result from doing that. And so this is a novel invention, and this meets all the criteria for novel and non-obvious to get a patent. And so now, of course, it took much longer than that to actually get the granted patents, but I'd say first, working with the good patent attorneys, what helped us there is that we knew if we could get to the stage of diligence where the investors would have their IP attorneys talking to our IP attorneys, we knew that we would be successful because we had great patent attorneys and they had a very strong strategy. And so for us, it was really almost pushing to try to get to that stage. And we would consistently say, if people would ask us on the IP, we would try to consistently say, you know, here's it at a high level, but if you have more questions, you should really talk to our IP attorneys. And I think if you look at, it's definitely the sort of mentality that you need a new chemical entity. And don't get me wrong, life is easier that way. But that is not the only way that one gets intellectual property. And there are many, many examples of this out there. And there are ways to protect things that aren't even just sort of traditional IP. So I think I think that if you really understand the sort of foundations of your work, and if it meets the criteria for being patentable, then it's a patent. And then you just have to think through, will we be able to protect this commercially? And I think we have.
And the only other thing I'll add is there's a lot of creativity in patent law. I will say we had one advantage that technically one of our drugs was generic, the other had not been approved, but had been studied investigationally. So that did help us a little bit. But at this point, Amylyx has, I don't know our exact tally right now, but upwards of 100 patents, and covering various different aspects of the drug, aspects of how you might use the drug, aspects of how you might formulate the drug, et cetera, et cetera. So I think often people, when they think about IP, just think about one patent, like the very simple directed, this and the disease, or whatever it might be. With a good patent lawyer, there can be a lot of creativity. And I think the patent examiners, the world, if you are truly innovating, wants to help you. If you are not innovating, doesn't want to help you. But I think there's usually a path. If what you're finding is truly new and surprising, there should be a path. Like, that's the point of the patent system,
Wonderful. So I just wanted to cover, because I thought there might be lots of questions around both those aspects, but why don't we open it up to the audience?
Hi, Josh and Justin. Thank you so much. I'd like to continue on with the conversation that Lawrence initiated with kind of several related questions. So first is, do you think, given your experience, that investors in the pharmaceutical industry is
You said playing it too safe. Yeah, no, great questions, and I think just the two to share, if people didn't hear, were are investors and pharma playing it too safe, and second, does our example provide some confidence, and maybe does that start to change what people look at as in terms of patentable and being able to be a pharmaceutical? We certainly hope so. On the second question, and I'd say, in our opinion, yes. I think that many investors and certainly large pharmaceutical companies, almost by nature, are quite risk averse, and so they like to see patterns, and they like to say, well, this is the highest bar, for example, for intellectual property, and if it doesn't meet that, then I'm not investing in it. And again, I think in both scenarios, I think this is where having good entrepreneurs is so critical. And not just entrepreneurs who, okay, I've done 5 companies before, but many of you in the audience who have great ideas or things in your labs or things in your groups. You will have a perspective and a passion about what you're doing that no one else in the world will. And to use our example, there were so many reasons that big pharma or more traditional venture capital investors would never touch what we were doing. To your point, 2 molecules that have been around before, given at very high dose, not coming out of a platform, didn't come out of a traditional sort of drug discovery pathway, but now it's turned into, I think, what we think is an important treatment for a disease that hasn't seen much. So I certainly think that that the maybe more status quo groups are too risk averse, but I think the answer to that is to have entrepreneurs who are willing to push through that.
So you talked a lot about the social impact of treating ALS and how it's set in these sort of humanitarian type values. And you seem in your words to be sort of putting the patients first and how important it is for these patients. So then why charge so much for the drug?
Yeah, great question. So, I think, we need to be able to run a sustainable business, I think is maybe the first thing. As, Lawrence mentioned, we raised $700 million to get here. And, we have to be able to raise a, sustainable business. When we were setting the price, the main priority for us was access. We tried to talk to payers, we tried to talk to insurance, and we tried to talk to every group to try to figure out, where is that balancing point where we can have a sustainable business but also have access. I think we did, cover that line pretty well. But it continues to be a challenge. I mean, I think it's a challenge generally in rare disease. When you're treating diseases that don't have that many people who have the disease, and you have to still convince people all the way down the line to invest stage after stage, year after year. It just makes for a hard business model. Just to be honest.
Yeah, and I'd add that I think drug pricing is really hard. We don't have a good solution for it, to be honest. I think what we thought is, how can we try to do our best to care for essentially the community we're trying to help? And so part of that, for example, as Lawrence was saying, is at launch, and even now we don't have provincial coverage of our drug. And right now, almost everybody in Canada who's on our treatment is on free drug. And so, you have to figure out these balances and trade-offs. I think that unlike in other industries, we don't have maybe more traditional pricing structures and supply-demand dynamics. And rightfully so. I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about people's lives. But I think, I would say in short, the drug pricing challenge vexed us for a long time. I think it still does, to be honest. But I think that what we thought is, as long as we can do everything we can to take care of the community we're serving, then I think we're at least living by our values. But in terms of just the general question of how drugs should be priced and how they should be paid for, I don't think we have an answer for that.
Hi there, I have a question from online. It's coming from Brenton Hamdorf, and they ask, how important were your initial investors in making the decision to grow and list Amylyx, rather than simply partner or trade sale the company following completion of the phase 1 study?
I mean, I think we always wanted to grow and build the company, but it is critical to have investors who also agree with that vision. You know, there are a lot of investors who have the view of get into a company and try to get out of it in 5 to 7 years for the maximum possible multiple. We were lucky that all the investors we had, you know, in our Series A and you know, in our early rounds were here purely for the mission. You know, we had the ALS investment fund in the Netherlands, and you know, many of the other folks who invested in us, you know, weren't doing it because they thought Amylyx was going to be the high returner, you know, in their portfolio. I'd also say I think it's important for an entrepreneur to want to build a company. I don't know if it's a healthy thing for a company to be built to sell, right? I mean, what does that say to your employees, to your team? You know, we're building this just to give it to somebody else, right? And the other thing was, you know, Justin and my dream, which I think we're finally, hopefully able to realize now, was if we could have a first approval, a sustainable product, that would allow us to invest back into research and back into new drugs and have this become a, you know, as you said, you know, impact fueling value and value fueling impact. So, you know, those types of things really excited us much more than, you know, becoming Amylyx a subsidiary of Pfizer or something like that.
Hi. You mentioned that you started your company 10 years ago, and that might be a silly question, but I know you said a lot about persistence, talking with the investors, but how do you deal with you're talking to them like so young and like to impose your like idea and show like, okay, we have like all this data, and because I feel that sometimes like big companies, they might underlook because of your age, and looking at you guys, I believe like if you say like you started like around our age or even younger, like how do you impose yourself to say, yeah, we have like a really good pitch and to make them believe that what you're doing is relevant?
It's a great question, and I think Josh mentioned a general phrase that someone told us that we really liked, which is he would say you need to establish your building blocks of credibility. And we lacked many of those. We didn't have advanced degrees. We hadn't done this before. We hadn't done research before, on and on. So we tried to get at it in different ways. One was having a group of advisors around us who would give us some credibility. As Josh was saying, that was our first slide for many, many years in our pitches because we knew that walking into the room, the answer was no. The second thing was data. And I think for people, we felt that we could have good scientific discussions, then we felt like the data was really strong. And we felt like if we could engage in real scientific discourse, then we would be successful. I think the other thing, going back to the theme we were saying, is constantly pitching and not being afraid to, because you learn so much from those. You learn both things that you may want to change about your business, but you also learn the questions that come up, and you change your slide deck based off of it. And you learn, okay, well, you know, maybe we need to highlight this more. Maybe we need to include this data. So I think it's a constant iterative process. But at the end of the day, it's also about having some thick skin. Most people said no. So I think it's a combination of all of those things.
Yes, working, okay. I just had a question about how you balance protecting your IP, so that cost, and the cost of manufacturing and developing your product, because that's something that I think comes up quite often for startups.
So, you know, I would say very early on, IP was, you know, very significant cost. It's one of the first costs any entrepreneur faces while starting a company. Manufacturing came a bit later and was one of our large costs as well. You know, I'd say, you know, we did it kind of as we did other things. You know, we fundraised, budgeted around it. I think one of the big lessons learned, as particularly around manufacturing, I think my story maybe is endemic of that, but I think we continue to do this, you actually want to over budget quite a bit for things like manufacturing. Stuff's going to go wrong. And I would say that business plan wide, almost for anything you can imagine, there's a chance it costs more and takes longer than you expect. So, business plan wide, even when you've said, okay, I've added up everything and it comes to this number, you probably want to raise twice that or it's not 20% more, it's twice that or 3 times that to be covered in case inevitably something, something goes wrong. But I guess on the IP side, I think it's, you try to get a lawyer who wants to build and grow with you and hopefully will cut you a deal for the first patent, hoping that there'll be a second and a third and more on the way.
Yeah, I think that's really important. That's something that we found is, so one, I would say, I think sort of foundational grants and things like that, it's part of why they're so important. But the other thing is finding partners, whether it's an IP or your corporate lawyer or manufacturing, who understand that you're a small company and you can't afford that much, but hope that this is a long-term partnership and never be afraid to ask for a discount.
You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that you guys are just celebrating your 10-year anniversary, so congratulations. But also with something like neuroscience, there's such a long period of disease progression. So when you're looking at something like a drug for something like ALS, how can you guys know for sure that there are going to be long-term benefits?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'd say the tough thing with ALS is that it's such a fast disease. That being said, that actually lends itself well to clinical trials because you can see a difference in a short amount of time. The best data we have to date is from our Centaur clinical trial, in which people were treated for 6 months, and then they were given an open label extension, so anyone could stay on the drug for as long as they wished. And we followed people for up to 3 years. And so that's the data we have. Now that being said, that was on 137 people, which in a disease like ALS is sizable, but it's 137 people. We have an ongoing phase 3 trial that we just completed recruitment. We have well over 600 people in that, so we'll get additional data. I would say, though, that something we're really excited about is also the opportunity for real-world evidence approaches. I think that again, sadly, because ALS is a very reliably progressive disease, it also lends itself very well to real-world evidence type approaches. So we actually have a partnership with Lawrence and a couple folks here and the Canadian Neuromuscular Disease Registry to do exactly that. And we think it's a wonderful opportunity to showcase that you can get a lot of really great data and long-term data in a much wider population without the need for a placebo group. So again, just early days now, but that's something we're really excited about to answer your question.
Could I ask perhaps a controversial question?
Sure.
Can you imagine knowing what you know and the experiences that you've had, particularly in the investment arena of starting up a company, a different way of creating strategies for any health-related condition, right? So clearly, many governments around the world support foundational research, even supports a bit of clinical research, right? To advance what we know about what's going on with the human body and with ourselves, the human brain and the nervous system, right? And there are some arguments that are made that, well, that's all public data because for the most part, it's generated by public funding. And yet when you want to take that knowledge and move it forward, right, there is this huge delta G, right? And is that delta G only made possible to surmount it? Is it made only possible through investment in the investment strategies? Or is there others? And I'm just wondering, because it is so incredibly expensive, right? Anything human and regulatory is so outrageously expensive, but yet there is a thought that, well, this is publicly funded knowledge that is generating all this IP and generating all these companies. So what's your thoughts on that? Is there a different way of doing business?
It's a good question. I think first I'd say 10 years into Amylyx, if you ask me what the company is built on, is it the idea or the execution? I would say it's 99.9% execution, 0.1% idea. So I guess to me, could you have other funding models? I think you certainly could. I think, I don't know what it says about the human condition, but I think people are capitalism does motivate a lot of investments. It's, the greatest source of fundraising that exists in the world today. But could there be a more mission-focused entity or set of entities for fundraising? I think there certainly could be. But, I think today the only source of really large sums of capital are investors in the capital market.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I'd say, one, going back to what I said at the start, I think the work you all and the environment you all have at the Hotchkiss Brain Institute, I think does facilitate that in a pretty remarkable way. I would say, though, that generally, I'd say if I look at our example, I think back and who is going to give us money, right? I mean, if we couldn't submit to NIH or any other groups because we didn't have PhDs or MDs. We certainly weren't going to get funding from any institutions because we had no pedigree, we had no background. So I think in a case like in Amylyx, I think you're going to have to find people who feel that there's, some sort of return, because otherwise, why in the world are, maybe if we were a charity. But, what I would say more generally is that I think we need far more change and sort of, I hesitate to use the term, but disruptive models and ideas in healthcare innovation generally. I think there are too few examples like an Amylyx. Most of the time, it's still kind of a tried and true model, but I would say that's part of why we haven't had the innovation that, for example, we've seen in the tech world. So I don't think I have a better model today, probably above our pay grade, but regardless, I think we need much better ways of innovating, because while, again, for example, we're really proud of what we've done, the fact that it took us 10 years to get here, and again, we're really proud of what we have, but it's not a cure. So I think we need to do better and faster.
So if there's no immediate questions, one of the undervalued aspects of entrepreneurial work and the process is partnership, is trust. If you read the Founders' Dilemmas, I think the statistic is 2/3 of startups fail because of founder issues, right? And I think that rings true. Maybe you guys can comment, because often this comes up as I connect with our entrepreneurs at the Hotchkiss in terms of where do I go, who do I trust, when you're not an expert in that process, right? And so how did you guys approach that? Rudy Tanzi obviously is a world-class, Alzheimer's neurologist and was very supportive. But maybe in terms of your own relationship or in terms of others, in terms of as you brought them in, how did you approach that?
Well, maybe starting with the question on founders, I do think that is maybe one of the most important decisions, probably the most important decision you make early on in a company is who you're going to do it with. I'm very lucky. I think Justin and I have been doing this together for 10 years. I think we complement each other well. I think he's strong in many areas where I'm weak, and I'm weak in areas, I'd say backwards, whatever. You get the point. But and I think that is maybe really important as an entrepreneur too, and it goes to your point on partnership, recognizing your own strengths and weaknesses. None of us are all strengths. But it's a business, and your goal is to always put forward strengths, and so you find people, teams, partners who can supplement you in the areas you're weak, whether that's things you just don't know about or don't have experience, or things that stress you out or are challenging. That's where you kind of supplement with additional people who can be incredibly helpful. In terms of working with others, I think it comes back to that humility. I think it's so important when you're working with others to know that they are bringing a certain expertise, respecting any partners, scientists, otherwise that might come along to help. A lot of people can do a lot of things with their time, and if they're taking the time to advise, help a company, it's a great thing. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add.
I'd just say in terms of partnership, I think one of the things, again, that we love about the industry we're in is that it requires so many types of expertise. We have 300 or so people at Amylyx, but we work with, I don't even know how many vendor partners, well north of 100, and each one of them have, some of them have thousands of employees. And it takes all of that working together to move things forward. And it's something that we really enjoy. But I also think that something that we, again, learned somewhat by necessity, but I think has really been beneficial for us, is the recognition that we can't do everything. And when we were just two guys starting out of university, it was very clear that we couldn't do most things. And so that meant that when we had partnerships, whether it was on a CRO or a manufacturer or an accountant or whomever, they had to be an extension of our company. And so that's something that's been really, really important to us as well, is making sure that everyone we work with is a real extension of our company. It's not, hey, do this work now. It's telling them the big picture. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's why it matters. And really, hopefully, they feel real ownership over the process too. So I think we learned that by necessity, but it's the model that we've continued to carry forward.
Thank you. And I like, as you were saying, that you still interview every employee. You're their last interview, and I think you mentioned you had like 28 scheduled or something next week. So thank you both. I think this was very, hopefully, illustrative of the success that we can have as a community, the impact we can develop for our patients and our community members, but also the value we can contribute to our economy and jobs, and I think all of those things. I think particularly in Calgary, we recognize the value of these aspects. So thank you both for your time and for coming.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
So that, I think, formally concludes our official program, but I want to thank all the panelists from both sessions. So, of course, Drs. Alamitha, Deborah Karash, Alexander McGeer, Lawrence Korengut. Also in the other session, Dr. Ty McKinney, Dion Kelly, Kyle Mayer, and Dr. Nicole Barioni. And the moderators, Aaron Phillips and Sam Story, thank you so much for doing this. I welcome our get-together with the companies and mingling, and more food. Is there booze? There's booze. So do that over there. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful. Thank you.